5 days before Christmas in 1943, a badly damaged American bomber struggled to fly out of Germany after dropping its load of bombs. At the controls was a 21-year-old pilot on his crew's very first mission. Half of the bomber's crew lay wounded or dead in the plane. Suddenly, a sleek, dark shape pulled up on the bomber's tail, a German Messerschmitt fighter. The German pilot was an ace, a man able to destroy the crippled bomber with the squeeze of a trigger. What happened next was one of the most incredible encounters between enemies during World War II, whose lives intersected in the skies over Germany that day, is chronicled in the book, A Higher Call. Before I relate the incident that brought these two pilots together, I need to tell you a little bit more about their backgrounds. The American Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown was a farm boy from West Virginia who came to pilot a B-17 Flying Fortress at a very young age. Franz, a former airline pilot from Bavaria who became an expert fighter pilot. Now, Franz's mother wanted him to become a Catholic priest. He and his brother both attended a Catholic boarding school where Father Joseph was one of the teachers, and he was also a close friend of the family. Well, one day when Franz was almost ready to graduate from high school, he sneaked away from school at lunchtime. The owner of the local brewery and pub caught Franz and his daughter in the bushes, and he dragged him literally by his ear back to the school and presented him to Father Joseph. Father Joseph, of course, angrily scolded Franz and said, your mother wants you to become a priest. What do you want to do with your life? I'd love to fly every day, Franz replied. So Father Joseph said, then go do it. Your mother will get over it. After a year of studying aeronautical engineering at a nearby university, Franz began flight training at the local airport. It was called the Airline Pilot School, and the government picked up the tuition because it needed pilots. When he completed his flight training, he accepted a job with Lufthansa, Europe's largest airline. Instead of flying commercial airliners, though, he flew navigators as an international route check pilot. His job was to establish the quickest and safest routes between Berlin and London, for example, and over the Alps to Rome and Barcelona. After 4 years, Franz had accumulated 2,000 hours of flying time. Then one day he was approached in the airport by a German Luftwaffe officer who said that the country needed him and gave him a sealed envelope with his orders. Eventually, he enlisted in the Luftwaffe and continued instructing young pilots. One of his students was his older brother, August, who said that he knew war was coming and that he would be drafted. If he had to fight, August said he preferred to fly. Franz, meanwhile, was content to teach flying. This all changed one day about a year later after Germany had occupied France. Father Joseph showed up at Franz's air base to tell him that August had been killed when his bomber, headed for England, crashed on takeoff in France. Fighter pilot to avenge his brother's death. His training was conducted by former World War I fighter pilots, and they stressed the need to fight well, but with honor. They said that the cross painted on the German planes was the same one as that worn on the shields of Teutonic knights centuries before. They considered themselves knights of a sort with a code of chivalry. Past his fighter training, he was assigned to fly for Fighter Wing 27 in support of Rommel's Africa Corps. This was a legendary desert wing and had just 120 pilots at full strength. Before he went up the first time, his squadron leader took Franz aside and told him he would always be outnumbered by enemy planes. Those odds may make a man want to fight dirty to survive, the leader said. But what I'm about to say to you should act as a warning. Honor is everything here. If I ever see or hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you down myself. Most of the Luftwaffe pilots, interestingly enough, were not members of the Nazi Party. To be a Nazi in the German Air Force, one needed to have joined the party at a very young age. Once a man was drafted or enlisted in the Air Force, the German defense law of 1938 forbade him from party membership. So in the German Air Force, a Nazi fighter pilot was actually somewhat of a rarity. Franz scored his first victory in Libya and described it to the squadron leader as a kill. The squadron leader angrily scolded him. You score victories, not kills. You shoot a machine, not a man. One of Franz's closest calls came when his plane was hit by ground fire during an attack on a desert fort. He belly landed within friendly lines and got back to his base on camelback after a Bedouin tribesman picked him up. August arrived. The pilots lived almost like animals at Franz's base in Egypt. They no longer slept in tents or under the stars. To avoid British strafing, the men slept in what they call graves, 6 by 6 holes packed into the earth and covered with a sheet of canvas overhead. Each man kept his cot, his blanket, and his belongings in his grave. The heat was often 125 degrees or hotter. There was no fresh water for showering. Everybody stank. He had accumulated 17 victories in North Africa by the time he was granted a much-needed leave. He returned home to see his mother and some of his girlfriends. After his leave, he was assigned to a fighter base in Sicily. He earned 2 more victories there, bringing his total to 19. Franz and his fellow fighter pilots were shipped back to Germany to fight the ever-increasing numbers of Allied bombers which were bombing German cities almost daily. Now, unlike Franz, Charlie Brown and his crew were new to the war. As I mentioned before, Charlie was raised on a farm. He lost his mother when he was 12 years old. He enlisted in the Army Infantry at age 18. Early on, he entered an Army boxing tournament. His opponent looked like a pushover to Charlie, so Charlie decided he would take it easy on the man. It turned out that his opponent was a former pro fighter, and he proceeded to beat Charlie soundly. But then he gave him some good advice. He said, you seem like too nice a guy to be in for the Army, and maybe you should consider flying. Charlie took his advice and applied for the Army Air Corps and was, of course, accepted and became a bomber pilot in training. Trained extensively in the United States and then were assigned to Campbellton Army Air Station in England. The crew would make its maiden flight in their B-17 Flying Fortress, which they named Ye Old Pub. They would be one of 475, that's amazing, 475 B-17s and B-24 bombers on a single mission to bomb a German fighter aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany, who were assigned Purple Heart Corner. This was the most vulnerable position in the formation. The mission commander said they could expect to encounter as many as 500 bandits, and that's the word they use for German fighters. It was shortly before he was to take off, Charlie got a warning from the chief mechanic to keep an eye on his number 4 engine, which had a tendency to run rough. Nevertheless, the plane flew smoothly into Germany and was about to begin its bombing run when heavy flak sheared away a large swath of the bomber's plexiglass nose. This allowed sub-zero wind to howl in through the hole and lower the interior temperature to 70 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Fortunately, the crew wore insulated, electrically heated flyer suits. The number 2 engine was put out of commission by flak. The plane was now reduced to flying on 3 engines. Collectively, the planes in the mission dropped 2.6 million pounds of bombs and then prepared to escape Germany as quickly as possible. At a horrible time for anything else to go wrong, Engine 4 began running irregularly like the mechanic had told Charlie at night. With only 2 healthy engines, the bomber lost speed and fell behind the main formation. It had become a straggler. Then the tail gunner reported bandits. It turned out there were 8 fighters blocking the pub's path to the North Sea. Worse, the bomber started having problems with engine 3, which was frozen at half power. With 1 engine out, 1 irregular, and now 1 at half power, Charlie knew they were on the edge of a disaster. Just as the German fighters started attacking, the pub's gunners discovered that their guns were frozen, welded shut by ice because of the intense cold inside the bomber. A German 20-millimeter cannon shell tore through the pub's right waist gun position and exploded, almost completely severing the leg of the waist gunner. A few minutes later, the tail gunner was killed and the tail gun position virtually destroyed. Another burst of 20-millimeter shells destroyed the radio compartment and disabled the radio. The radio operator had a tiny piece of metal embedded in one eye as a result of that. The fighters kept attacking, and finally Charlie started flying straight at them, figuring it was better to duel head-on rather than having the fighters hanging on his tail. A bullet fragment embedded itself against Charlie's left shoulder blade, and another destroyed the oxygen in the cockpit. With his oxygen gone, Charlie's eyes faded and his head went